The morning started with silence. No hum of the fridge, no light in the bathroom. I flicked the switch. Nothing. Half the power in the apartment was out. My frustration boiled as I fumbled with the breaker box. When I finally gave up, I called Logan. "Can't you call someone to fix it?" he asked, his voice distant, like always. He didn't wait for my answer before hanging up. Hours later, a knock at the door. I opened it to see Owen, Logan's younger brother, with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Logan said I could stay for a few days," he said, stepping in like he belonged. His grin was as casual as ever, but the sight of him threw me off. I hadn't seen him in years. Without waiting for me to react, he glanced around the apartment, noticing the peeling paint and clutter. "Cozy," he said, smirking. Then his gaze settled on me. "Logan mentioned the power issue. Show me the breaker." I hesitated, but led him to the hallway. He knelt down, fiddling with the wires like it was second nature. "You've been doing everything on your own, haven't you?" he asked, not looking up. I stiffened. "It's just a fuse." He glanced over his shoulder, grinning like he didn't believe me. "Sure." Moments later, the power was back, but the silence between us carried more weight than the broken lights ever had. That evening, Owen was still there. "Let's fix the outlet in the living room," he said, grabbing his keys. Before I could argue, I found myself in his car, heading to the hardware store. The drive was quiet at first, until he turned on the radio and started singing loudly, off-key. I couldn't help but laugh, caught off guard by how carefree he seemed. "You should stop," I teased. "You're scaring the pedestrians." "See, you can laugh," he said with a grin, like it was some great discovery. At the store, he joked about every tool we picked up, like a stand-up comedian performing just for me. His energy was contagious. For a moment, I forgot about the stress that usually sat heavy on my shoulders. Back at the apartment, we worked on the outlet together. I held the flashlight while he replaced the wiring, his movements quick and confident. "Dad taught me this," he said offhandedly. "It's funny Logan always hated helping, but I liked figuring it out." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. By the time we were done, it was late, and the apartment felt different, lighter somehow. When he suggested cooking something simple with the scraps in my fridge, I didn't protest. We ate omelets at the small kitchen table, laughing over stories of his travels and childhood memories with Logan. At one point, his eyes lingered on me, his expression soft. "You've been too serious for too long," he said, almost like a challenge. The comment stuck with me, even after the laughter faded. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel entirely alone in that apartment. It was late when Owen suggested making dinner. "You've been feeding me with your hospitality all day," he joked. "Let me return the favor." I wanted to say no, to keep some semblance of normalcy, but instead, I found myself shrugging. "Fine, just don't burn the place down." He moved around the kitchen with surprising ease, pulling ingredients from the fridge and humming quietly under his breath. Watching him, I realized how different he was from Logan, unhurried, present, as though nothing else mattered except this moment. When the food was ready, we sat at the tiny table, the dim light above us casting a warm glow. As we ate, the air between us shifted. The easy humor of earlier gave way to something heavier. His gaze lingered longer than it should, his tone softer, more deliberate. "You deserve more than this, you know," he said suddenly, his words cutting through the quiet. I froze, caught off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" Owen leaned back in his chair, studying me. "I mean, you're doing everything. You're holding this place together. Does Logan even see that?" My throat tightened. This isn't his fault. He's busy. He works hard. "I'm not saying he doesn't," Owen said, his voice low but steady. "I'm saying, you deserve to feel like someone's in this with you. Really in it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I got up and started clearing the table, desperate to shake the weight of his words. But later, on the porch, when he joined me under the stars, the air felt different again. He stood too close, his presence filling the space between us. "You're not alone, you know," he said quietly. His voice was warm, reassuring, but it was his nearness that set my heart racing. For a moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. The apartment was silent, save for the sound of running water as I washed the dishes. Owen was still there, somewhere in the living room. I kept my hands busy, trying to focus on the mundane instead of the subtle shifts in the air between us. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Turning my head slightly, I caught his reflection in the window above the sink. He was leaning against the doorway, watching me. "You never stop, do you?" he asked softly. "Someone has to keep things running," I replied without looking at him. He stepped closer, and I felt the weight of his presence behind me. "That's not what I meant." The words lingered, heavier than they should have been. I set the plate down and turned to face him. His eyes were steady, searching mine for something I wasn't ready to give. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I shook my head, dismissing the question. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "It is," he said firmly. "Because you're not, and you know it." I tried to brush past him, but his hand reached out, catching mine. It wasn't forceful, just enough to make me stop. His fingers were warm, steady against my skin. "Owen, don't," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't what? Ask you to be honest? Care about how you're feeling?" His gaze held mine, unflinching. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with everything unspoken. Then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, he leaned in. It wasn't forceful or rushed, just a soft, hesitant press of his lips against mine. My breath hitched, my body frozen between pulling away and leaning closer. For a moment, the world around us disappeared, but then reality slammed back into focus. I pulled away, stepping back like I'd been burned. "We can't," I whispered, shaking my head. He didn't argue, didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, his eyes heavy with something I didn't want to name. "I know," he said quietly. But the damage was done. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing. There was no going back to the way things had been. The next morning was quiet. Too quiet. Owen's duffel bag sat near the door, packed and ready. He was leaving, and I couldn't decide if it was a relief or a loss. I busied myself with breakfast, avoiding the weight of his presence in the room. Logan sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging either of us. It was just another day for him, another morning blurred into his endless routine. Owen leaned against the counter, sipping coffee. He glanced at me, his eyes searching for something unspoken. I avoided his gaze, focusing on the eggs sizzling in the pan. Logan, oblivious, glanced up briefly. "Thanks for helping out, Owen," he said flatly before returning to his screen. Owen smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, anytime." When breakfast was done, Logan excused himself, mumbling something about catching up on work. That left Owen and me standing in the small, cramped kitchen, the silence between us louder than anything Logan had said all morning. "I guess this is it," Owen said, breaking the tension. I nodded, still unable to meet his eyes. "Thanks for helping with everything." My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. He grabbed his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. As he reached the door, he hesitated. Turning back, he looked at me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "You deserve to be happy, you know," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Even if you don't believe it yet." I swallowed hard, feeling the words hit deeper than I wanted them to. "Owen," he held up a hand, cutting me off gently. "It's okay. I just needed to say it." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. Logan reappeared moments later, still glued to his phone. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, not even glancing up. I forced a smile, but my chest felt hollow. "Yeah, everything's fine." But it wasn't. As I stood there in the quiet of the apartment, I felt the weight of everything Owen had left behind. The words, the moments, the questions I couldn't unhear. And deep down, I knew I could never go back to the way things were.